Not so long ago, a monster came to the small town of Castle Rock, Maine. He killed a waitress named Alma Frechette in 1970, a woman named Pauline Tutaker, and a junior high school student named Cheryl Moody in 1971, a pretty girl named Carol Dunbarger in 1974, a teacher named Etta Ringgold in the fall of 1975, finally, a grade schooler named Mary Kate Hedrassen in the early winter of that same year. Cujo was published in 1981, and it's another one of those Stephen King books that everyone knows about, but seems that no one actually read, since the pop culture osmosis version of the story, it's quite different from the real book. It's a return of horror, after the small sidestep that was Charles McGee's story, but a more realistic type of horror. Because we are not going to find anything supernatural in Cujo, just a very honest adult fear. It is also the first book of King that is officially connected to a previous one, as it continues the story of the now infamous small Maine town known as Castle Rock, that started way back in the Dead Zone. 5 years have passed since John Smith helped discover Frank's Dodd identity as the Raincoat Killer, and the town is ready for a new kind of horror. One that will leave deeper scars than Dodd in the real world, where we, the constant readers, live, and will shape Castle Rock for years to come. This is also one of those books whose connections are very clear and don't require much knowledge of the original. But here's a very interesting thing. I have mentioned before, I just mentioned it now, how some of King's early books suffer from pop cultural osmosis, where people know certain things of the plot because everyone talks about them or makes references to them, but they still haven't actually read the books or seen the movies. And if it was bad with, say, The Shining, it's even worse with poor old misunderstood Cujo. There is a reason I choose to talk about bad press in a book where formally we don't have any journalists among the named characters, and it's just not because there is a bit of subplot where bad reporting causes a lot of trouble for our limited cast. But enough stalling. I'm Adalisa Zárate, and today I'm going to tell you about a very good dog who got very, very sick in Stephen King's Cujo. By 1981, Stephen King was already a name in horror literature. Every novel before Cujo had been a bestseller, and most of them had been adapted to movies. Of those who had been, we still had to see a really bad one, Maximum Overdrive, the horrible adaptation of his short story Trucks, directed by himself, was still 5 years away. As a writer, King was on top of the world. However, his books were growing darker and darker, and Cujo is what I call the first of his really cruel book. Before, we always had a small glimpse of hope, of good things for the future now that the book was over. Sure, Carrie died, but Sue could tell her story and try and humanize her. Salem's Lot was lost, but Ben Mears and Mac Petrie were still fighting vampires. As far as we knew then, Danny Torrance had escaped the Overlook without any big consequence. John Smith died too, but Greg Stilson would never be president and destroy the world. And finally, Charlie McGee could have hopes of a normal life after destroying the shop. There was always a light at the end of the tunnel. Even The Stand, which I am going to talk about much, much later as I still have to figure out how to tackle that break, had a somewhat hopeful ending in both versions. Cujo breaks that streak. But let's start from the beginning, just like with the other books. What is Cujo about? The Trenton family, from the outside, seems like a perfect American family. Husband Vic is a graphic designer with a small but successful ad agency. Wife Donna can dedicate herself to their home, and toddler Tad doesn't have a care in the world. In contrast, the Camber family struggles. Father Joe is a good mechanic, but also a wife beater and an alcoholic. Mother Charity just goes through the day in a daze, fearing the day in which their son, Brett, will come to resemble his father more than her. At least Brett is somewhat a happy boy, and has his huge Saint Bernard dog, Cujo, to keep him company. But on the same week, things change for both families. Charity wins the lottery. Not a big prize, she doesn't become a millionaire, but can negotiate a vacation for her and Brett away from Joe. Not because she wants to escape, not really, but because she wants to show Brett a different world, at least for 2 weeks. And at the same time that Big's ad agency is facing their worst crisis yet, he finds out that Donna had been having an affair, and he has to leave to solve the crisis before he can even start to think if he wants to rebuild their marriage. To make things worse, Donna's car is failing, so Vic suggests that she goes to Joe's house rather than to the next town's car dealership. Donna is not quite sure, as she fears Joe. He is that kind of man who makes any woman feel uneasy in his presence, especially so far away from town and anyone who could hear her scream. But when on the first day with her and Tad alone, the car almost leaves them stranded on town, she decides to take Vic's advice. And she takes Tad because the kid just refuses to be left alone with a babysitter. What she doesn't know as she takes that fateful trip is that Cujo, the big friendly dog that she met a year before, got bit by a rabbit bat about a week or so earlier. That by the time she took the car to the Chambers farm, Cujo was already in the second stage of the illness, and in the rabies-induced madness he has killed both Joe and his neighbor Gary, leaving him as the only living creature to hear how her car stalls for one last time as she and Tad arrive to the farm. By then, Cujo is far from the friendly dog she remembers, but he is still big, and although she doesn't know it, he is convinced that she is the one that caused his pain. Cujo is, in a way, easy to dismiss as one of King's easier books. Despite being cruel as heck, the story itself is quite simple. A woman and a kid trapped in a car by a rabid St. Bernard. There are cuts to the woman's husband's work crisis, to the woman's former lover injured, and to the dog's owner's wife's personal crisis. But those stories on the surface seem to be distractions from the main gory event. Although the first two deaths happen around page 100, the actual horror doesn't really start until page 200, and the last two deaths are around page 270, 30 pages before the end. Some readers, not all, especially not dog lovers, came to this book for an animal attack story, not for the ins and outs of the anti industry in the early 80s. So yes, it can be frustrating. But you know me, I can't leave a Stephen King story just on the surface level. So let's talk about how King predicted both the way his book would be misunderstood and how media works when it comes to making something really innocuous seem worse than it is, starting with what Cujo isn't. So, if we go by the fame Cujo has, it's the story of some sort of demonic dog that goes around killing people because it can. For a while, it was even the name people gave to any mean dog, rabid or not. Some people, even King fans, even people who have read the book at least once, tend to describe it as a possessed dog, and they try hard to give a supernatural explanation to Cujo's malice during the later part of the book. Every other subplot is rarely mentioned, and the fact that it's the first full book set on the beloved town of Castle Rock, and as I mentioned, the second time we visit that particular corner of King's Maine, doesn't seem to come up much in conversation if someone talks about Cujo. King's mental state with writing does come up a lot, but that's not really relevant to the conversation right now. And there is a parallel to that perception within the book, only it is not about Cujo himself. It's the ad agency subplot that I keep mentioning. See, Big Trenton's, Donna's husband, has an ad agency, which has the Sharp cereal accounts for years. It's like the equivalent of Kellogg's, I believe, and their ads are for award-winning sometimes. But those ads include one which are with a character called the Sharp Cereal Professor, who is pretty much as if Mr. Rogers sold Quaker Oats for kids, or cornflakes, healthy or sort of healthy cereals. But then the company creates a sugar bomb, cereal, that is so bright red that the box itself looks like it was full of blood when you open it, at least according to Roger, Pig's partner. And due to a mishap between the dye formula, a couple of unlucky kids with stomach bugs, and a really slow news week, the thing resulted in a lot of kids barfing and evacuating bright red. Some mothers got terrified, went to the hospital, and despite no one actually getting hurt or sick by the cereal, the whole thing became a PR nightmare for the company and, of course, the ad. Especially as the cereal professor tagline was, "There's nothing wrong here." Just imagine for a second what happened with the infamous Black Burger King burger, only with people actually thinking that it was something serious and not just, the dye. By the time we get to the story, the news have died down a little, but the idea that the sharp cereal causes internal bleeding, news at 11, is still circling around people's head, despite it not being anywhere close to what really happened. Just like Cujo is not possessed by the spirit of Frank Dodd or any other demonic entity, even if King did give us a really red herring in the form of Tad's closets, which may or may not have a horrible monster inside it, who, if it existed, must have been really mad that Cujo got to the family before it could. The narrative at all times tells both things. How unfair is it for the press, and later the cereal company, to blame the ads for the situation due to the tagline, and I know it's absurd, and it's as absurd as it sounds, and it reminds me of a lot of the stupid news that came the week when I was trying to write this script. And how Cujo, in the end, was nothing more than a good dog that got sick. The last paragraph about Cujo includes the line, "It would perhaps not be amiss that he had always tried to be a good dog." And it wouldn't, because he was. His very last conscious action before the virus took hold of his mind was to run away from his boy, a heresy to his dog mind, because he didn't want to hurt Brett. It was just bad luck that by the time the Trentons came, Cujo's mind was completely gone thanks to rabies. And yet, people insist to call Cujo a murderous, cruel killer, even if two of his victims weren't what we'd call innocent or even good. In fact, I need to note that Cujo only killed 3 people, a low body count for Castle Rock in general, and that the 4th person who dies in the book, while it was because of Cujo's presence, it was not because of Cujo's actions. All this does not mean that Cujo has no villains. There are people we can blame for what happened, even if Cujo getting rabies was just an accident. Just as, again, with this parallel that I'm pretty sure it was accidental on King's part, but works, the whole sharp cereal thing was not the ad agency's fault, or even the cereal's fault, but the fault of those who magnified the news and later lied to make a good headline. And while those people get mostly their punishment within the pages of the story, it's unfortunate that everyone forgets them, or worse, mourns them, when thinking about this story. Let's start with Steve Kent, Donna's lover. His role on the drama is pretty small. He's horrible. He's a horrible man. He even considers raping Donna at one point. And the only thing that stops him is that Donna was not home when he arrived. However, his actions, in particular deleting a message that Donna left for whoever came when she was not around, and tell them that she was at Joe Camber's house, because he erased that and he vandalized the whole place. Unfortunately, there was no one to know that she was alone at the Camber's farm, so no one went to check for him. And he gets scot-free. Yeah, he gets a slap in the hand, I believe, for the vandalism, but he almost destroys Donna's marriage, and he is the cause for Big to take so long into insisting to check the Camber's farm. But he's a minor villain. Big one would be Joe Camber's, Cujo's owner's dad, and the second victim. If there is anyone to blame for the whole mess, it's Joe Camber, because he was the one who simply never cared for taking Cujo to a vet once, much less getting the pup his rabies vaccination and keep it current. He's also the reason why Donna is out there, and the reason why his wife never worried that he was not answering the phone for 3 days, because he was not only abusive, he was also, as I mentioned, an alcoholic. So Joe not answering the phone was not a cause of worry or even a cause of, well, maybe I should not take my car there, but more like, because we weren't at home, he went to his friend's house and he's probably sleeping off a hangover, in the case of the wife, and oh well, he's probably in his garage and he cannot hear the phone, in the case of Donna. Yes, this is before cell phones, but I am pretty sure that if someone updates the story to add cell phones, Joe still will find a way not to answer the phone even before he dies. And we also really need to talk one day about how in King's early books, alcoholism and drugs abuse is always present, and it's always a negative influence, even as the man himself was riding high on both. But today is not the day. There is not a single redeeming quality to Joe. He hits his wife, he's raising his kid to hate rich, stuck-up town people, got Cujo only because it was a way to look good to his son, and only because he got a discount on his food. When his wife wanted to go and visit her sister, he had to be blackmailed into it. He decided he was to take a vacation as she was out, and the last thing on his mind was who was going to feed Cujo. He's so despicable that when news of his death get to Charity, his wife, she is relieved that she will not have to choose between misery and a divorce. And so mean that his son, when he sees that Cujo is sick, chooses not to tell his dad immediately because he's afraid his dad will not let them go to visit his aunt. And yet, at the end, he's seen as a victim. The press, always ready to talk about grisly events, counts him in the first headline as a victim, painting Cujo as evil. Rabid dogs kill 4 in bizarre 3-day ring of terror, the Portland Evening Express recounts. Later, someone would point that dog had no shots, local vet. No one blames Joe. No one says, hey, this would not have happened if Joe Chambers had been a better person. And despite that, just as Joe is never mentioned as abusive owner causes death of 4, including himself, for example, Cujo is never referred to anything in the press that is not either rabid or killer. Just as the Sharp cereal is never just a misshaping in the dye formula, Cujo doesn't even deserve a bit of mercy. The press found their story, and they are not going to let something as silly as the truth to get in the way of it. Even as the book itself finishes reminding us that Cujo, in the end, was nothing but a good dog that would have died for his man, his woman, and more importantly, his boy. A good dog that had been struck by a horrifying sickness that has no cure, that it's a death sentence the second it enters a poor animal's nerve system. Pop culture doesn't care either. Cujo is a killer dog, a demonic dog, the ultimate beast, according to the book's cover, even when underneath, in a smaller font, it clarifies that there is a sleeping evil, crueler than death itself, and the most hideous menace to ever ravage the flesh and devour the mind. None of that matters. Steve Kemp, Joe Chambers, Gary Pinscott, the neighbor that also dies, who wanted to shoot people who were coming too close to his farm. They are all the victims because there was no one to see what they really did, and no one cared for the dog's story because, well, it was just a dog, a rabid dog that had to be killed. And on the other hand, although I have not mentioned it much, there was also that the fourth Tad, the little boy, he doesn't die because of Cujo, in the sense that Cujo doesn't kill him. He died of dehydration and heat stroke. He died because he and his mom were locked in the car for almost 3 days with little food and little water. Just like so many dogs and even children have died because someone forgot that they were in the car. But none of that matters. I mean, after all, who would actually read the book to find out the truth? Who would actually ask the victims to find out the truth when the headline is so catching? It's very hard for me to recommend Cujo as a starter king book. In fact, it's hard for me to recommend Cujo as a king book, since it's so cruel you will end up crying. The movie is a bit better as the ending is a little less gloomy. Just a little. If you love dogs, you will still cry. And while the prose is as engaging as any of the early King's books, the fact that it leaves so many dangling plot lines open might end up frustrating you. For example, as I mentioned, there are a ton of paragraphs dedicated to the monsters in that closet, and Frank Dodd's malicious ghost that led to nowhere. Frank's mentions can be chalked to people remembering the horrible murders and projecting their fears into Cujo. There's a lot of projecting into that poor dog, but that closet, in occasion, closes by itself, and at one point becomes bigger in the inside, as if it was the portal to a darker, edgier Narnia, and that goes absolutely nowhere. In fact, we never find out if there was something there. not even in the later Castle Rock stories where Cujo has unjustly joined Frank Dodd as part of the town's boogeyman. What I can recommend, even if you don't read the book or watch the movie, is that please vaccinate your pets. And if you can, any stray that you happen to catch. I will leave links to anti-rabies programs in the description down below because honestly, rabies is a horrible disease and we should do our best to eradicate it. I want to thank my dear patrons, Kaysar Quaranza, Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, and Jessica, I am sorry if I butchered that, as well as my first supporter, Tanya Pineda. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adalisa, written link on the description as I know my name can be hard to spell. And with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, comments so the algorithm catches engagement, and of course, you sharing the links. I will also welcome all your questions, comments, and suggestions in the comments below. And I hope to see you here next month when we will be witness to a love triangle gone terribly wrong as we meet the Red Fury herself, the gorgeous Christine.